Welcome everyone to the Senate and House Joint Committee for Commerce today. Committee, quick announcement, there is a voucher in front of you. Unless you were in tax, you should have gotten it in tax committee. Otherwise, we need those back. We do have a full agenda, but before we start, I'd like to turn the meeting over to Vice Chair of this committee, Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for all your work on this, and your staff and the staff of the committee to put all this together in such a short period of time. You did a great job. I want to take just a moment to recognize a good friend of ours, Les Mason, that passed away in the last week. He was one of my best friends up here, and really, if you went to his funeral, you saw that he had a lot of best friends up here. I mean, people drove for hours and hours to be there, and we filled that church up. His legislative family did a wonderful job of supporting his family. But Les loved the legislature. He loved this job. He took it very seriously, but he also always found a way to find humor in things and just make things a little bit easier. He was one of the funniest people I knew. In my first 2 years here, he was the Commerce Chair in the House side. And then he got elected as Assistant Majority Leader because he really wanted to help guide the freshmen. And he did a wonderful job in that. And he took it so seriously that he stepped down out of his position for Commerce Chair. And that's when I stepped into the Commerce Chair. And I was always nervous, and he was on the committee still, and he was very supportive. And we always, a lot of them probably heard, but almost every meeting that we had, he would say, "Great job, Mr. Chairman." And I would always say, "I can't take all the credit, Les," every single time. So I would just like to just take a moment here of silence to remember our really good friend. Great job, Representative Mason, and you can take all the credit. Thank you.
Thank you. We will all miss Les as a colleague and a friend and an all-around great guy. Committee, the purpose of today's meeting is an informational hearing on the bill draft relating to star bonds and agreements with major professional sports franchises. As an informational hearing, this committee will not be taking any formal action at this time. The committee's task is to thoroughly vet the contents of the bill before us by listening and asking clarifying questions of the conferees. This is not the time or place to debate the bill. That time and place will be on the floor. The process will be as follows. We will have an overview by our revisor, Jason Long, followed by questions, followed by proponent testimony. They have been given 45 minutes, and then opponent testimony with the same amount of time. All of the submitted oral and written testimony is available and has been uploaded. Even though it may not be on your agenda or in your packet, it is available live online. Are there any questions from the committee as to the purpose and process of this meeting? Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate this. I did look live online on the 2024 special session website. I looked under Senate Commerce. Perhaps I'm just a little bit daft. I've been unable to find the online version. Is it under House Commerce? Or if we can get guidance from staff so we can put this out to folks that are following along at home, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Representative, I do know that there has been a special location. I'm going to ask staff to email that link to committee members so you can distribute or access as necessary. Any other questions from committee members? Seeing none, we will begin with an overview of the bill by our revisor, Jason Long.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Chairman Tarwater. members of the two committees. Jason Long with the Office of Revisor Statutes. I will, as the good chairwoman pointed out, this is a legislative bill draft that this informational hearing is on, and so to the extent this is an overview of just that draft in its current form in front of you today. I cannot speak if there are any minor changes between today and tomorrow morning when the bill is formally introduced and receives a bill number. Tomorrow, we, of course, would update any information as necessary if there are any changes between now and that time period. But for the draft in front of you, it is legislation concerning STAR bonds, the economic development program that's spearheaded by the Department of Commerce for major tourism developments in the state of Kansas. What the bill does is it utilizes the existing STAR bond structure and creates an alternative path towards STAR bond approval with some additional changes for STAR bonds issued with respect to a development project involving a major professional sports complex to be located in the state of Kansas. And so there are alternative procedures and requirements for establishing this special type of STAR bond district and STAR bond project, including new definitions. And the definitions, just right at the outset, limit the application of these new parameters and these new requirements to only a development for a major professional sports complex. And this is for a major professional sports franchise that competes in either the National Football League or Major League Baseball, and that is located in an adjacent state. So we have a definite market of available NFL and Major League Baseball franchises that would be able to take advantage of this to relocate into the state of Kansas and utilize the STAR Bond Economic Development Program to finance a portion of the costs of that development under the proposed legislation. In addition to the alternative procedures for creating this STAR Bond district and project, there are new requirements for approval of the project, new sources of revenue for paying off the bonds that are issued, and new parameters for how the structure is to work for this particular type of STAR Bond project. To start with, the first new wrinkle in this is that this can be initiated by the Secretary of Commerce on the Secretary's own initiative. Under current law, it is a city or county that initiates a STAR bond development project, but under this legislation, the Secretary can do so of their own initiative. Now, a city or county can elect to participate in that STAR bond development project that the Secretary has initiated by adopting a resolution or ordinance to that effect and pledging a portion of their sales tax and transient guest tax revenue tax increment to paying off a portion of the bonds. But I'll get into that in a little bit. Initially, the Secretary could initiate this district by entering into an agreement with a major professional sports franchise. As I said, those are limited to just those competing in the NFL or Major League Baseball and currently in an adjacent state to the state of Kansas. The agreement, however, before it can be executed, must be proposed to the Legislative Coordinating Council. And the Legislative Coordinating Council then must approve that agreement before the Secretary of Commerce can execute the agreement and make it effective. There are several provisions in new Section 1 of the bill draft concerning this step of LCC approval. For starters, there's an initial 1-year time period for the Secretary to propose the agreement and the STAR Bond project plan to the LCC that would end initially on June 30th of 2025. So next year. There is, however, an option for the Secretary to request an extension of an additional 1-year period if they're not ready to propose an agreement to the LCC at that time period, or if the Secretary does not request an extension, the LCC of its own initiative could extend that time period for an additional year. So you're looking at a total of a 2-year possible time period for the Secretary to negotiate and come to an agreement with a professional sports franchise to locate in the state of Kansas using the Star Bond Development Program. At the LCC meeting, the secretary would present the agreement, the Star Bond project plan, and any other documents that a city or county would normally request in approving a Star Bond district. Those would also could be requested by the LCC and presented to the LCC. The LCC could keep those documents confidential while it is reviewing those. It could meet an executive session to review those, to hear from the secretary and any other individuals the LCC deems necessary in considering the proposal. But any vote to approve or reject the agreement must be done in an open meeting of the LCC. If the LCC does reject the agreement, the secretary is free to go back, renegotiate with the professional sports franchise to come up with a amended agreement, which the secretary could then propose to the LCC for review and consideration and approval within that time period window for approving agreements. If the city or county elect to participate with the secretary-initiated Star Bond Development Project, then they must pass that resolution or ordinance pledging their tax revenue increments within 60 days after the LCC has approved the agreement. So there is a window of time for the local city or county where the district is going to be located to act and elect to participate in that development project. There is still the option for the city or county to initiate the Star Bond Development Project. They could go ahead and do so. They could create the district, develop a project plan for a major professional sports complex under this legislation. In that case, the agreement with the secretary would not be required, as the city or county would go through the governmental review and market study process. However, the city or county must still get LCC approval of the project before they can go ahead with the Star Bond project for a major professional sports complex. So that LCC approval is still necessary, whether it's secretary initiated or local municipality initiated at the project level. Some of the changes that are unique to a major professional sports complex Star Bond district. As I said, the district can be established by either secretary or the city or county. The district can include property that is already included in an existing Star Bond district. So there can be an overlap with this particular type of district with an existing Star Bond district. How outstanding bonds within that existing district are handled, I'll get to a little bit later when we talk about the financing aspect that's being proposed under this legislation. The district may also include non-contiguous property. So you could have a central portion of the district, and you could have other portions of the district that are not contiguous to that central portion, but all be included within the real estate description of the district. And the district may include property that is not subject to development with the Star Bond proceeds. So there could be real estate that is part of the district. There could be sales tax revenues that are used from that property to pay the bonds, but none of the bond proceeds are going to development of that particular parcel of real estate that is within the Star Bond district. Outside of that, most of your other provisions under existing Star Bond statutes would apply to the real property within the Star Bond district that is being created. With respect to the project, how it's defined and the cost of the project is a major professional sports complex that must have a combined capital investment of at least $1 billion. That is billion with a B on it. The development can include a stadium that seats at least 30,000 seats. It doesn't necessarily have to include the construction of a stadium for the professional sports franchise. It could include practice or training facilities for that franchise. It could also include any other buildings, structures, facilities, or attractions and improvements to the such that are located within the Star Bond district. However, it is described and established. There is descriptions to allow for the vertical construction costs. So while there is a general exclusion of vertical construction costs being covered by the bonds of Star Bond, the proceeds of Star Bonds, This particular project would allow for vertical construction costs with proceeds from the STAR bonds that are being issued. Going into the financing, the actual bond issuances and how they're repaid. If the secretary initiates the STAR bond district and the project, the secretary can then turn around and authorize the Kansas Development and Finance Authority, KDFA, to issue the bonds for that project. These would be special obligations of KDFA. They would not constitute state debt. The bonds alternatively could be issued by the city or county that's initiating the STAR bond project. And so that is still an option as under current law for the city or county to issue those bonds, and all those existing statutory requirements on that issuance would apply to the city or county in that instance. If the secretary is initiating the project and asking KDFA to issue the bonds, the secretary is essentially stepping into the role of the city or county governing body in that case, and is delegated all authority of the city or county with respect to the STAR bond project under the proposed legislation. The bonds could be issued for up to 70% of the project costs for the STAR bond project. That is an increase from current law. Current law caps it at 50% of the project costs. So for this particular STAR bond projects, it could be 70%. The bonds could have a 30-year maturity date as opposed to current law, which caps it at 20 years to pay off the bonds. There are provisions for additional bonds to be issued if there are additional project costs that occur as the project goes forward and additional bonds are necessary. Those could be authorized and issued by KDFA up to 70% of the project costs, those additional project costs. The one caveat with these projects is those additional bond issuance must also be approved by the LCC. So there's additional approval by the LCC of that additional bonding authority. I will take a quick step back just to clarify a point I did happen to glance over. The legislation does cap this at 2 STAR bond districts and 2 STAR bond projects total. So you can only have 2 districts and 2 projects, presumably 1 project in each district. That is a cap on this. So you wouldn't have several of these major professional franchise sports complex projects going on in the state, only 2. Going back to the bond financing, to pay off the bonds, there are the usual revenue streams of state and city or county sales tax and transient guest taxes available. The local tax revenue, that tax from increment on local sales tax and transient guest taxes is only available if the city or county has initiated the STAR bond project and is issuing the bonds, or has opted to participate in the secretary-initiated project by adopting that resolution or ordinance within 60 days of the LCC's approval and pledging their tax increment of their sales and transient guest taxes. In either case, with or without city or county participation, 100% of the state sales tax from retail sales within the STAR bond district could be used to repay those bonds, and 100% of the alcoholic liquor enforcement taxes that are collected from sales of alcoholic liquor within the STAR bond district should be used to pay off the STAR bonds that are issued by KDFA or by KDFA if it's secretary-initiated STAR bond project. One additional wrinkle with this legislation and using the tax increment, under this legislation for these particular STAR bond projects, the base year valuation on which the tax increment, you have a base year and then it's the increment of the additional taxes that are collected. That increment is what's used to then pay off the STAR bonds. That base year valuation is set by the secretary at the secretary's discretion for a secretary-initiated STAR bond project for these particular projects. If it's a city or county that is pledging a portion of its sales tax to that, it's the city or county that has the discretion to set that base year valuation. And so then the tax increment would be determined based off of that base year valuation as determined by the secretary or the participating municipality, whichever is the case. One final additional revenue stream that's added to these particular Star Bond projects is monies from the Attracting Professional Sports to Kansas Fund. You may remember that fund was established when sports wagering was authorized by this legislative body and signed into law a few years back. So the monies that are sitting in that fund can be accessed by the Secretary of Commerce to help pay off the bonds that are issued for these types of projects. And then there's some additional funding that the legislation also directs for that fund, and I'll get to that a little bit later. I do want to note that, as we talked about, you could have overlapping Star Bond districts under this legislation, and so you could have outstanding Star Bonds for a Star Bond project in existence being paid off with sales tax revenue, and then this new professional sports Star Bond complex project comes on top of that. To the extent there are outstanding bonds, then the sales tax revenues that are being used to pay those outstanding bonds would continue. Those bonds would receive priority over any new bonds that would be issued for the new major professional sports complex Star Bond project. And so the outstanding bonds would be taken care of first out of those revenue streams, and then the new bonds that would be issued for the new project. As I mentioned, there is an Attracting Sports, Professional Sports of Kansas Fund that could be utilized by the Secretary to pay off these Star Bonds. Already, as I mentioned before, there is a percentage of sports wagering revenues as received by the state goes to that fund under 74-8711. The legislation that's proposed would amend the State Gaming Revenues Fund, 79-4801, to direct a portion of the State Gaming Revenues Fund to the Attracting Professional Sports to Kansas Fund. So we're going to have a fund transfer potentially under this legislation. Under State Gaming Revenues Fund, those are funded by transfers from the lottery operating funds from sales of lottery tickets. And under current law, there's already $50 million is earmarked for expenditure from the State Gaming Revenues Fund from those monies. That includes EDIF, Problem Gambling and Addictions Grant Fund, and monies for correctional institutions and juvenile detention building funds are some of the purposes for that. Monies on top of that go to SGF, the State General Fund. Under the proposed legislation, that $50 million will stay in place and will continue to go as it's already currently being funded under current law. An additional almost $21.5 million would still go to SGF. I think it's $21.49 million would go to SGF under the legislation. Any amounts that go into the State Gaming Revenues Fund above that amount, so above that $71.49 million, would then be transferred each year to the Attracting Professional Sports to Kansas Fund. And those monies in that fund, the Attracting Professional Sports to Kansas Fund, could then be utilized by the Secretary to pay off the Star Bonds for the major professional sports complex Star Bond project. So there's that additional funding under the legislation. As you glance through, you may see some other amendments to Star Bond Financing Act. These are simply amendments to make some conforming amendments to include KDFA references where necessary, since they are going to be added as an additional bonding authority under the legislation, or to add terms referencing a major professional sports complex Star Bond project as necessary. And then also you'll see amendments to two liquor taxation statutes, 79-4108 and 79-41A03. These are also conforming amendments directing the Secretary of Revenue to take those alcoholic liquor enforcement tax sales that are collected within the Star Bond District and remit them to the bond payoff funds, the appropriate bond payoff fund, rather than remit them to the State General Fund and to the State Treasury, as is typical with alcoholic liquor enforcement taxes. The legislation is set to go into effect on July 1st, publication of the statute book. With that, Madam Chairwoman, I'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Thank you, Revisor Long. I do want to point out to the committee, I failed to do so before the overview. Note that it was 75%. That has been changed very recently, and it is at 70% for the initial or any additional funds that would be financed. And with that, we will open it up for questions for the revisor. Senator Reddy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a few questions. So first of all, I wanted to know, when we're talking about the Star Bond District, word on the street is we're thinking Wyandotte County. Have we heard about anybody from their elected officials or their population regarding this this conversation today?
I have not had any conversations with the unified government of Wyandotte County. I can't speak for the proponents, and I can't speak for the unified government as to how involved they have been in these discussions. I would have to defer to their lobbyist.
Madam Chair, I have a few more, if you don't mind. Thank you. You mentioned the alcohol funds, all of the revenue in the Star Bond District that's in that revenue bond in the Star Bond District would go towards paying off this debt. Typically, the alcohol revenue sources go to 3 different pockets when they are sent back to the counties. So would the counties not be receiving that revenue for their own entities and their communities?
That's my understanding under the legislation, that the portion that would normally go back to the municipality for presumably enforcement purposes would no longer go there. 100% of the alcoholic liquor enforcement tax would be remitted to the bond payment funds.
So that's on top of what they're doing. And you mentioned the sports wagering revenue. You spoke about the close to 75 million that's already earmarked, let's say. You said anything above that would go towards this new attracting sporting funds. How much was that this year? How much of that revenue was that above the beyond the 75 million? How much did we collect is what I guess what I'm asking.
I would have to refer to legislative research. I think they have some numbers on lottery gaming revenues that they could distribute to the committee that might answer that question.
And one more question. There was a conversation, well, there's in your documents indicated resolutions and ordinances, which are typically done by the elected body. Is there anything that's good that has to be put out for a public vote in these types of instances?
The municipalities would have to follow their standard procedures for adopting a resolution or an ordinance, which requires a public meeting to approve those resolutions and ordinances pledging a portion of their sales tax monies. There are no unique or additional requirements with respect to these particular types of resolutions or ordinances. They would follow their standard procedure.
Thank you. I have more, but I'll ask them later. I appreciate it.
Yeah, committee, I may limit the number of questions so that every committee member has an opportunity to ask, and then we will circle back as time allows. Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my questions are dealing kind of with the local revenue streams that we're anticipating. I understand unless there's some kind of a local government participation monetarily, that there's really not much opportunity for input. Is that kind of how that goes? Unless they pledge some of their local revenues.
So if the secretary is initiating the Star Bond District and project, there is no requirement that the secretary go and get input or hold a public hearing within the community where the district or project is to be located. No, and you are right. If the local government wants to participate, they would, to fully participate, adopt a resolution ordinance pledging a portion of their sales tax dollars.
And so I know that that would be the local option then on the sales tax. And I'm assuming that they would be able to pledge just a percentage of that and not their whole sales tax dollars. And then I'm kind of curious about the other local revenue streams, if they're addressed at all, or if they would be addressed later, like in a development agreement, for example, like the property taxes, the real-time electric use, those types of issues.
So the Star Bonds focuses primarily on local sales use and transient guest taxes. The provisions with respect to these particular Star Bond projects allow the local government to set its base year valuation at its discretion. So to that end, it could basically pledge whatever portion of additional increment tax revenue that it wanted to pledge. Obviously, those would probably be communications with the secretary and working out the full project plan that would go in front of the LCC for approval. I would imagine the secretary would want to have those numbers before going in front of the LCC for approval of the agreement. But that is something that's in the discretion of the local municipal government as to how much of those local sales use and transient guest taxes they were going to pledge.
And if I could, just one follow-up to that, they have then 60 days, is that correct? Just a 60-day window to make that decision on what local revenues then that they would commit to the project?
Well,
And-
they would have 60 days from the LCC approval to adopt a resolution or ordinance, which is essentially finalize their participation and pledge of their revenue streams.
Okay, thank you. And I may have other questions, but I'll move on to other people.
So noted. Representative Probst and committee, research has handed out distribution of traditional lottery proceeds for you to look at per Senator Reddy's question. Representative Probst.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Jason, I just have one question to get some context and clarification. On page 17 towards the bottom, there's language that says that if in the event that a city doesn't participate, the secretary shall have the powers of the city or county. And I'm just curious you can provide me some context on what that looks like.
Those would be the powers within the context of approving a Star Bond district and project. And so to the extent the city or county, typically under current law, has those powers of approval to create a Star Bond district and then approve a Star Bond project, those creation powers and establishment powers are delegated to the secretary if the secretary is initiating this particular type of Star Bond district and project.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Jason. A quick question. You mentioned the problem gambling addiction fund. Could you clarify if there's going to be a negative impact to that? I missed that piece.
The Problem Gambling and Addictions Grant Fund has designated funding through the Lottery Operating Fund and through from revenues from sports wagering, and none of those revenue sources are being diverted to the Attracting Professional Sports in Kansas Fund.
Representative Osman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Jason, for your information. So it appears that under Section 2U20, which is 910 of the underlying bill, it's going to expand the scope of the Star Bond reimbursement to professional costs and soft costs that include setup and developer fees. So this appears to be an expansion exclusive to this particular section as compared to any other Star Bond district. Is that correct?
So I assume you're referring to the major professional sports complex costs on page 9 and to the top of page 10. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, those are spelled out here just for this type of project in terms of some of those related costs. I will point out for the committee's benefit on page 10 and what is now paragraph 21, those related expenses for a project, and that includes a project for like this, shall require prior approval of the Secretary of Commerce. So there is a check by the Secretary in developing the Star Bond project plan of what costs are going to be included within that Star Bonds project plan and covered by the Star Bond proceeds.
Great, thank you. If you could speak historically, I don't know if you're able to, but we've amended the Star Bond ordinance or statute several times. Has there ever been discussion on that point for other Star Bond districts?
Well, we've had the related expenses provision subject to secretary approval for a while now. I think that's been applicable, and that's applicable under the general definition of project cost for any STAR bond project. And so that's been in place. I don't know. I don't have a lengthy history of STAR bond legislation, particularly in the last 10 years that it's been amended. We can certainly look back on the records and see if there's been any discussion with respect to those types of costs, but I'm not aware of any extensive discussion on that issue.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Jason. A lot of municipalities pay for their economic development through transit taxes. And so a hotel within the STAR bond itself, would that transit tax go to help pay off the STAR bond, or would it go to economic development that is in that municipality?
Well, that would depend on the participating municipality. If they elect not to participate, then none of their transient guest taxes would go to these particular STAR bonds. If they elect to participate or they initiate it themselves, then the city or county would set the base year valuation, and the tax increment above that base year on their transient guest taxes would go to pay off the STAR bonds.
Thank you.
Senator Schallenberger. Other questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you, Revisor Long, for that overview and for answering those questions. Committee, we will move on to conferee testimony. Conferees, we'll start with proponents. You have 45 minutes. They were given that time frame and decided how to divide it up amongst the people who are testifying. And then the opponents will have the same amount of time. I ask conferees not to read your testimony to us. We do have your testimony, a hard copy and electronic copy available, so please do not read your testimony. I will make the announcement that although we are keeping to that time frame with a goal of a 5 o'clock adjournment, we will stay and answer any question that committee members have, even if it's past 5 o'clock. So if we do not get to your question during the allotted time for conferees, please make note of that. We will circle back and give you an opportunity to have all of your questions asked and answered. So we will begin with proponent testimony. The first conferee we have is Dan Murray on behalf of Scoop and Score. Welcome to committee, Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I haven't seen this many cameras since my men's fitness photo shoot years ago. But seriously, I think it is indicative of the excitement and interest in this proposal. We are really excited to be here today and appreciate it. Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, ranking members and members of the committee, my name is Dan Murray and I'm here today on behalf of Scoop and Score. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to discuss this historic opportunity. But before I get to that, I first want to thank you for returning to Topeka, albeit under special circumstances, to once again work to provide much needed tax relief to Kansans. This is and should be your priority, and I, along with most Kansans, are pleased to hear that an agreement has been reached on that issue, so thank you very much. I'm also pleased to be here, and I don't think she's here, but maybe listening online, to welcome back Representative Blue. As many of you know, her husband celebrated his first Father's Day yesterday as daddy to Bryn, so we're happy to have her back as well. Many of us in this room grew up watching the Chiefs and Royals with our dads and grandpas, and then cheered with our sons, daughters, and grandchildren as the Royals became champions again, and the Chiefs ignited a white-hot dynasty that is still rewriting the record books. For generations, Kansans have embraced the players and coaches, their wins, their losses, and their national championships as our own. The risk that the Kansas City Chiefs and the Kansas City Royals, our Chiefs, our Royals, could be lured away by other states is not a risk that Kansans want to take. They have resoundingly said they want to keep the Chiefs and the Royals in the region. The legislation before you today seizes a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to protect a Midwest tradition and recruit a major franchise to Kansas. I'm here today on behalf of Scoop and Score, We are a not-for-profit formed to engage in public policy advocacy, research, and education, including grassroots lobbying in support of economically prosperous and responsible legislation. This includes the Star Bonds legislation before you today. It gives Kansas a seat at the table when it comes to securing a permanent home for the Kansas City Chiefs and delivering new economic growth for the state. Star Bonds are the right financing tool for building sports stadiums in Kansas. Star Bonds were designed to develop large-scale commercial, economic, and tourism projects. For nearly 2 decades, Star Bonds has given Kansas a leg up in attracting major investments. The Kansas Speedway, Children's Mercy Park, Village West. Billions in investment, thousands of tourists, and millions in revenue generated for the betterment of the region and the state. Revenue generated, in this case, in Northeast Kansas, but distributed statewide across the 4 corners of Kansas. When Jackson County, Missouri voters rejected the extension of a tax on every taxpayer doing business in that county to support stadium renovations in a Royal Stadium, it did 2 things. One, it firmly placed the coveted Chiefs and Royals at risk of moving outside of the region. But 2, thankfully, it put Kansas in the driver's seat. It gave us a way to provide a better way to keep these 2 proud franchises in the Kansas City region. Finally, next, we would agree with the Kansas Chamber and President CEO Alan Cobb when he said, "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for Kansas. The state's Star Bond economic development tool was designed precisely for this type of high-traffic attraction." So why do we need this bill? Well, no one tool is right for every job. Just ask any of the local tradesmen who will work on building these stadiums. This bill strengthens the financing tool of Star Bonds to carry out the job of attracting investment to professional sports teams in the development in Kansas on our side of the state. So how does it do it? And I appreciate Revisor Long for talking through many of these things. But it creates a new class of project eligible for Star Bond financing called the Major Sports Star Bonds, aka Stadium Star Bonds. It allows for financing up to 75% of project costs for Star Bonds, allows for a 30-year repayment term, requires at least 30,000 seat stadium, requires at least a $1 billion in investment. No more than 2 of these projects can be approved. And this is, I think, key, there's a 1-year term on this offer that we put forward in the statute, unless the LCC provides for an extension to that for an additional year. So how do these Star Bonds work? Well, new sales tax created by the district, along with the new alcohol taxes and the already created attracting special professional sports teams fund in the Commerce budget, may be used to support these special obligation bonds. These bonds are sold to private investors whose purchase of the bonds provide part of the upfront capital to build the project. Private investment provides the rest. I think it's important to point out that Star Bonds are different. Unlike general obligation bonds, only those revenue sources above the established baseline can be pledged to pay back Star Bonds, the Star Bond buyers. Star Bonds are not the debt of the state or local governments. State and local credit and taxing authority are not on the hook to repay the bonds. Kansas taxpayers are not at risk. Cities and counties may participate, but they're not required to. The bill provides for Stadium Star Bonds to be issued by cities, counties, or by the Kansas Development Finance Authority. No local sales tax, transient guest tax, or other tax revenue can be pledged to pay a Stadium Star Bond unless local governments vote to do so. Guardrails, guardrails, guardrails. The bill not only enhances Star Bonds for stadium development, it also strengthens the checks and balances before they can be used. There are 4 guardrails to ensure only prudent projects are approved. First, the Department of Commerce must vet any development proposal to locate a stadium in Kansas. Next, independent, nonpartisan economists must review the project and issue a feasibility study determining whether the project makes sense, whether it can meet the needs and work in Kansas. Third, and I think this is critical, one that's not in existing Star Bond statutes. The agreement to be signed must be reviewed and approved by the Legislative Coordinating Council. That gives this body, your legislature, an opportunity to sit at the table and make sure that that project is viable and makes sense for your constituents. Finally, the free market will test the project. Private investors will decide whether the project is worthy of investment. If and only if the project can pass all of these safeguards, will a stadium star bond project happen. So let's discuss the policy decision before you today. Opponents of this bill have already attempted to confuse this policy decision. They lob super specific questions and ask for details that are beyond the scope of the question before you. The question before you today is whether this new economic development tool will be added so that we can attempt to keep our Chiefs and the Royals in this area and bring them to Kansas. It is the job of the Department of Commerce and any willing local government to negotiate the details of the project with the investors, developers, and franchises that might make Kansas their home. Typically, that is where it ends. But under this bill, after those details are worked out, the LCC will have a role to play in vetting the agreement of these details. Opponents would have you to believe that this is the job of today, but that is not so. Today, for you, is like the pre-approval stage in getting a mortgage or an auto loan. You are asked today to approve the financing process and set the conditions for a project. Just like a loan, no proceeds are available unless and until the buyer provides satisfactory evidence that the loan can be paid. That is where the 4 guardrails I spoke about earlier come into play. Before I close, I want to say one more thing about what you may hear today. Some have tried to compare the idea of stadium star bonds to other jurisdictions that fund or own stadiums. They point to studies from nearly 30 years ago that say subsidizing stadiums do not work. Those arguments and those studies miss the mark. Stadium star bonds are not subsidies, and they are not public funding of stadiums. They are a financing tool that uses revenues generated by economic activity within the project to repay private investment. These are revenues that would otherwise not exist. Only 3 states have star bonds, so unless the study is from Nevada, Illinois, or Kansas, I would be skeptical of what you've been hearing. Madam Chair, in closing, maybe you remember watching Brett Wilson White beat the Cardinals in '85. Maybe you remember Hank Stram urging the boys to keep matriculating the ball down the field. Maybe you lived through the 80s and saw Marty Schottenheimer bring the gleam back to the shine of the proud franchise of the Chiefs. Or maybe more recently, you remember the 2014, 2015 Royals, and of course, the worldwide franchise that is back-to-back Super Bowl winning Chiefs with Mahomes, Travis, and maybe Taylor. For me, I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma listening to Denny Matthews and Fred White. They called games on a crackly AM radio in the garage. I listened with my dad. My dad would load us up a couple of years, or a couple times every couple of years. I had 4 older brothers. He'd load us up in our 1979 Ford Econoline van, 4, 5 ornery, redheaded boys, and we would come to Kansas City and watch the Royals games. At the time, I thought, it's so sad my mom can't join us. And now I realize it was a vacation for her, for us to get out of the house. But I realized at the time when I came up with a pie-eyed look in my eye that I was going to the big city, the big city of Kansas City. And I think my experience was very similar to many others, that having a franchise or franchises in this region is so key to attracting people to the area to enjoy and participate in our economy. But no matter how you came to love these teams, they have made a major league impression on our region, our state, and our hearts. Today, we have an opportunity to support a bill that gives Kansas a chance to keep these teams in our area. Today, our region and our state face a choice. Are we still looking to grow, to develop, and prosper? Or are we content to sit on the sidelines and watch major league investment leave our area? Kansas was built by people with winning aspirations, people who reached for the stars. With the passage of this bill, we can continue that legacy and prove that Kansas is and will continue to be a home to champions. We thank you for the opportunity and thoughtful consideration of this bill and encourage your recommendation of its passage. In my testimony, I've attached 3 things. The first is polling information showing that a clear majority of Kansans support legislation taking action to keep the Chiefs in the area. The second is a list of more than 9,000 Kansans who've signed on to the petition. That list has grown, as we've heard today, to nearly 11,000 Kansans and growing. The third is a document that clarifies some of the misinformation being spread about star bonds and their use in Kansas. And with that, Madam Chair, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Murray. We will hold questions till all of the proponents have testified. So next we'll have Corb Maxwell from Polsinelli Law Firm representing the Kansas City Chiefs. I believe we have about 30 minutes for the remainder of proponent testimony and questions. Welcome to committee, Mr. Maxwell.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairman Tarwater. Thank you, all the members of the committee. I'm Corb Maxwell. I'm with the Polsinelli Law Firm, and I'm proud to stand before you today representing the Kansas City Chiefs. First, I want to send out to the committee the sincere thank you from Clark Hunt, the Hunt family, Mark Donovan, and all of Chiefs Kingdom. Wow. I know you all had to come back for taxes, but that we have this room together, this attention, the president and the speaker inviting us into this process, it really is stunning. It shows when a state wants to do business, what it can do. And that feels so great to be sitting in our shoes to see what all of this means. And before I start to comment on the bill, there were so many great comments provided by the revisor and Dan, but I also just want to take the moment from a personal perspective and just pinch myself. This is unbelievable, right? Here we are. I've been a lifelong Kansan. I've worked in economic development for 20 years. I've been in this room. I've had you guys throw stuff at me before, left and right, and it all feels like it was a warm-up to this moment. We're here talking about the Kansas City Chiefs coming to Kansas. How unbelievable is that? It's just a pinch ourselves moment. But it was also brought home to me today when I was leaving to come up here that my son's never really thought anything that I do is cool, right? 9-year-old boy, he doesn't have any interest in politics or the law or economic development. But what did he say when I walked out of the door today? Go bring Patrick Mahomes to Kansas. And even more important, my 6-year-old little girl, what did she say? Go bring Taylor Swift to Kansas. So it's pretty cool for the first time that I'm sure a lot of us are in the moment of talking about tax policy and regulatory environment and all the things that we do and try to build for our state. But for the first time, our kids think we're all pretty cool in what we're talking about. The revisor did a great job, but I would just say for someone who's been in the trenches for 20 years, Star Bonds is unique, but Star Bonds has a proven record in this state. We have done projects from Atchison to Garden City, Kansas City to Wichita, and there's been great success out there. And no better place is an example than Wyandotte County. We had fallow farm fields out there that produced almost no taxes, either property or sales. And now it's pumping out $1.2 billion of retail sales every year on an annual basis, putting those into the state general fund, putting those into a county that had a lower economic rating but prior to all of that, and it's really changed their course and changed the course of our state by creating this economic powerhouse. And we could do it all again and make it even bigger. It's fantastic. And the great thing about it is it all comes at zero additional tax burden to taxpayers. It is the exact same process at the point of sale. A person comes to buy a good, to buy a beer, to buy a ticket. They pay the exact same taxes that they would, but for the Star Bond. It is the same tax burden. It's just we redirect those taxes that would have been created to put them into the development at the first part. That's unique. That's a Kansas way. That has not been figured out in many other states or cities across the region. They're often doing tax increases, general taxes. That's not what this bill is about. That's not what our history has been about. And that's not what's being put forward here. We think this is a unique proposal that could allow something amazing to happen and continue on the great history we've seen in the past. Been asked several times through this, why are we doing this? Why do we have to rush? Why are we having this in special session? And the point is that time is of the essence. The time is now. Missouri spoke, Jackson County spoke, they had their opportunity. But now there's a moment for Kansas to step up and an option for us all here. In talking with Clark and Mark, when we were looking at doing renovations of Arrowhead in the past, that usually was a 7 to 8 year process to plan a renovation. We have 6 years left on the lease for Arrowhead. We're behind. We're behind on the clock. Now, the good thing is all of us know that the Chiefs play pretty well when they're behind. They've had a pretty good success story of being able to be behind and still pull it out. I don't think we want to let this thing get down to 13 seconds, though. We really want to see if we can take action here through this special session to put the tools together, provide the tool to the Secretary of Commerce, that the legislature gives the tool to the Secretary of Commerce. But importantly, in giving that tool to the Secretary of Commerce and the locals all throughout the region, that we have the legislature still involved in this process and that the LCC, as Dan said, is the guardrail. Your representatives will be the watchdog to make sure that all of this bill is constructed in the right and correct way and that our state can be proud of it, that it's truly bicameral, bipartisan, with the legislature and the administration all coming together that says this is a deal that could be negotiated with either of these teams and that we can stand behind. Representative Curtis, you asked a great question. This bill is about local control. For the first time in the Star Bonds process, it has given us the option that locals can not put in all of their taxes in that. But if they do so, which is their choice, they do not have to put in all of their taxes, they also are not involved in the incentive document negotiation. That being said, they still, of course, have all of their powers that they normally have of zoning, land use, planning, building permits, police power, all of those normal local powers. They would have all of those to be involved in this process. And we've, of course, given them multiple ways that they can decide to participate in the process or not. We've set incredibly high thresholds to be involved in this bill. It takes one of the two major franchises of MLB or the NFL and over $1 billion of investment to qualify. In our normal Star Bond law, it's $75 million. We're starting at you have to have $1 billion investment. Being involved in Kansas economic development for a lot of times, there's very few projects that have a B in front of them. We've done lots of 10 million and 100 million and multiple $100 million projects, but this starting point is $1 billion, and we're going to be way beyond that. And if we do that, not only do we have the opportunity to be able to host the 10 regular season NFL games and all of the postseason NFL games, but if we're able to create that development and do it the Kansas way, we could also win a Super Bowl, a playoff game for the collegiate football. We could have the Big 12 play here for the Big 12 championship game. I'm sure there's a lot of K-State fans here that would like to be instead in Kansas instead of traveling down to Dallas. And near and dear to my heart, we could get a Final Four. Last time we played a Final Four in Kansas City, 1988, that worked out pretty well for the Jayhawks. Would be great if we had the opportunity to do it again. And we've seen that our region can be successful. I'm pleased to represent a franchise and an owner that's the legacy of Lamar Hunt. He was the founder and the visionary of the Chiefs, but also of the American Football League, who was known when they started as the Foolish Club. But Lamar was that visionary and knew that America as a whole wanted more football. But he also knew one thing, that he saw that Kansas City as a whole could be an incredible region to host a team. And boy, was he right. 6 decades later, 4 Super Bowls, we've proven that the Kansas City region is an unbelievable place to host an NFL team. And we have another incredible owner just across the parking lot from us in the legacy of Ewing Kauffman. We had the Kansas City Athletics leave Kansas City, but Ewing Kauffman knew, as a great businessman in Kansas City, that for a town to be major league, they needed major league teams. He has a famous quote to the same. It feels like this very same thing is coming forward for us as a state. If we want to be in major league, we got to have major league teams. This is the greatest opportunity we've had in any generation, and it's here before us right now. So I'm excited about it. Madam Chair, I know we're going to ask a ton of questions later, and I'm happy to answer all of the questions that the committee would have. But beyond my prepared testimony, I thought of a few other things that I've kept hearing through this process and thought that maybe would be helpful to clarify of how do star bonds work, and is the taxpayer really not liable for that? How can this be? We've heard a lot of misinformation put out there about how this could end up impacting. And importantly, star bonds stand for, right in their name, sales tax and revenue bonds. They are revenue bonds. They are secured only by the revenue of a particular district or project out there. These are not general obligation bonds of the city. These are not general obligation bonds of the state. These are not general obligation bonds of KDFA. These are revenue bonds and revenue bonds only. Not only does the law say that we're passing now, the previous star bond law says that, and if we get to the point of issuing bonds and doing the bond documents will say that 25 or 50 times in bold type all throughout them, again and again and again and again. And what does that mean to be a revenue bond? What it means is that if you're issuing a general obligation bond today, that you're the state of Kansas or you're the city of Overland Park, you have that general taxpayer pledge on it, and you're going to be able to go and issue that bond at, say, 4%. These bonds, these revenue bonds, they're instead going to be able to go and be issued at something like, say, 6%, 200 basis points higher, 2 percentage points higher. Instead of 4, they'll be 6. Well, that doesn't sound that great, but what it means is that's the risk premium. That is what a bondholder is paying. They know and understand that these are not general obligation bonds of the state, so they pay more in the process, slightly more. And why do they do that? They do that because they know if, God forbid, there is a default or a problem, it is on them and them alone. It was their free market choice to buy the bond. That was their risk they took. And if that bond should ever fail, they and they alone take the loss, not the taxpayers, not the city, not KDFA, not anyone else. We set it all up from the beginning, and everybody understands the rules of the game. So it's inaccurate to say that the taxpayers or a city or the state would ever be on the hook. That would be against how we set these up from the beginning and what the risk is to them. And we have great evidence of that. The great evidence of that is we've had a singular star bond in all of the history that has run into some problems and isn't making its debt service right now. And that bond has not been bailed out by the state, not been bailed out by the city, not been bailed out by anybody in this process. The only person taking a loss on that project is the bondholders in that. So I think we can all feel very confident as we move forward on this, that star bonds as a tool work, that have a good history, but this legislation that we are putting in front continues to build off that, and the taxpayers will not be on the hook for anything that we're doing here. Another scary word that's been bandied about is eminent domain. Are we going to use eminent domain? Is eminent domain going to be part of this process? First and foremost, absolutely not. We have no intention, no desire, There is nothing in this bill that is having the legislature or anyone authorize anything to do with using eminent domain. We have also set this up that this bill is site agnostic. We are not picking a particular piece of dirt. We are not picking a county. We are not picking a city. That is all very intentional. We want landowners to come forward and raise their hand. We want developers to bring forward projects. We want the cities to bring forward their projects. We do not want any way that we are trying to coerce a landowner into doing a deal. So we've set this up to let the free market work. And lastly, nothing in this bill changes the current law of the state on eminent domain. And that is, if you want to use eminent domain for economic development purposes, there is only one body that can do that. And that is you all, the legislature. The legislature itself must also authorize it and must pay 200% of the value. We have no intention, we have no interest, but you all are the ones that hold the key on eminent domain, not municipalities, not the Secretary of Commerce, and for sure not the teams. And there's been another couple of questions and points made about cities and municipalities and would they be able to pay for all of the additional police, fire, infrastructure that would come along and the burdens that that would be. The first point I would make is let's make it a burden, right? And what do I mean by that? If we're talking about additional police and fire and the need for that, that means we've been wildly successful. That means we're having big events. That means we're hosting folks that are coming to our state, enjoying games, going to retail development, going to hotels, and creating a great success for our state. But second and most important, that's not a burden that falls on the city. Current way we have operated in the past, Sporting Kansas City, our other great stadium that's been built by Star Bonds. Those extra police time, that is all paid for by the team. And I see nothing different happening for the Chiefs or the Royals, that we are currently in Kansas City, Missouri. The Chiefs are one of the biggest payers of overtime to the police force. We do it year in, year out. We spread that wealth of having that overtime going out into the community because we're paying that as a team. We see that, we have that in our budget, and there's nothing different that would happen if we come to Kansas, just as what we've seen in the past. So I think that's an unfair criticism, and in fact, flipped on its head is a benefit of this, that we'll be able to pick up the cost of all of those things. With that, Madam Chair, I know you're going to take questions. I'm happy to answer now at the end, however the committee would appreciate it. But again, thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity. This is truly exciting. We look forward to being great partners and working with you through this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Maxwell. We have about 8 minutes for the remaining proponents. We'll take questions at the end. Next, we have David Franz from Stinson Law Firm representing the Kansas City Royals. Welcome to committee.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Dave Franz, partner with the law firm Stinson LLP. We serve as counsel for the Kansas City Royals, and I'm pleased to be here to offer these remarks on their behalf. You have heard more than enough about the structure of the legislation, so I won't speak about that. The only thing I will emphasize is we are pleased that the description of a sports project includes a Major League Baseball stadium. We recognize that while the Royals have been physically located in Missouri, a lot of Kansans view them as their home team as well, and we appreciate that. Last year, the Royals announced plans for a downtown stadium in Kansas City, Missouri, contingent upon a vote to continue a sales tax in Jackson County. That vote failed on April 2nd, and we are put in a position of needing to look at other alternatives for a stadium going forward. The Royals lease at Kauffman Stadium ends after the 2030 baseball season. So there is an urgency to this. We do not have a lot of time to start looking at it. And this Star Bond legislation that you are considering offers a very good opportunity for us to explore an option in the state of Kansas. We know that the vast majority of star bond projects have been successful, and we believe this legislation offers an opportunity for even more successful star bond projects. To give you some sense of the magnitude of this, the Royals play 81 regular season home games at Kauffman Stadium, and this year we anticipate having over 1.6 million people attend our games. The Royals local ownership team, which is led by John Sherman, is committed not only to building a stadium, over $1 billion, but also to investing in an integrated adjacent entertainment district. These entertainment districts have been built in others adjacent to stadiums in cities as diverse as Washington, D.C., Atlanta, and in San Diego. And those stadiums, coupled with those entertainment districts, which include complementary uses like hotels, residential, office, commercial, have done a great job of enhancing the development in those areas in their communities. To give you some sense, attached to my written testimony is some financial projections of the economic impact that came from the Crossroads Stadium in Kansas City, Missouri. Obviously, it's too soon to make projections now on a development, but as you can see from that information, it was prepared by JLL, an internationally known real estate consulting firm. As you can see from that information, the number of jobs and the amount of economic development created by these facilities, the potential order of magnitude of that is vast. And we think that's important to understand. And we anticipate that a Kansas location would have a similar economic impact. I just want to conclude by saying that if this legislature moves forward with this star bond legislation that you're considering, the Royals look forward to talking with the state of Kansas further about an opportunity for a future stadium. Thank you. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Francie. Next, we have Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs from the Kansas Chamber. Welcome, Mr. Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, and members of the committee. Good to see you all. Welcome back. Eric Stafford, Vice President of Government Affairs with the Kansas Chamber. I could probably say I have the most unique perspective in this room because I remember the only playoff game without a punt. I remember the second largest comeback in playoff history. And I remember these things because I'm a Colts fan, and they both happened against the Kansas City Chiefs. So I could say I'm probably totally impartial here on what happens, on whether these teams move here. But I will say they are great. Our kids are Chiefs fans. We have Kelsey and Mahomes jerseys in our house, and they're definitely fun atmospheres. But do appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I think from our perspective, Dan mentioned Alan's quote, and I think that summed up the conversation that we had from our board meeting just last week, where really the driving narrative from our board members was the fear that Salt Lake or San Antonio could take the Chiefs away from the Kansas City region, whether it's in Missouri or Kansas. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they felt that the opportunity to bring the Chiefs to Kansas, and it was said verbatim, which Alan used in his quote, was truly a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And so I think that is what led us to initiate our support for this proposal that you guys are going to be considering officially tomorrow when you guys are in for special session. But I think, too, it's important that when you look at my testimony, I talked about the Tennessee Titans and the Las Vegas Raiders and how they finance their stadiums using taxpayer dollars. The Raiders obviously are going to use tourism more to fund it than other states. But Tennessee Titans, $500 million from the state. Corb hit on this, and I think it's what makes this opportunity so unique is that it's paid for through the consumer choice in those districts to fund and finance the project to the level that it is. That's what makes Star Bonds unique. I know there's been some criticisms of Star Bonds and some of the programs it's been used for, some of the projects it's been used for, and that's fair, but that's up to the legislature to make the criteria clear in terms of what qualifies that. I know there was some legislation back in, I think it was 2017 dealing with Star Bonds, maybe 2015, to kind of put a little bit additional protections in there. But ultimately, I think what they've come up with and this plan specifically that we're talking about today has been very well vetted, and they've paid attention to the detail in terms of how to structure the program. So with that said, I know that there could be one potential change. Madam Chair, you spoke about that at the beginning, but keeping that bill clear from amendments that could potentially harm the outcome of what would be a good move for the state is important. But ultimately, I'll just close and say that these are the types of projects like the NASCAR track that Star Bonds was built for. True, successful, large economic development programs. So really, I'll summarize with our board that they just really felt the threat that the Chiefs could leave Kansas City. It's real. I mean, you see it. I just said the Las Vegas Raiders. It's not the Oakland Raiders. It's not the Los Angeles Raiders. It's not the St. Louis Rams. So teams can move. But I think everybody here, including me, as somebody who wears blue, values what the Chiefs mean to this region and to people in this state. So happy to answer any questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Stafford. Our final conferee or proponent is Tom Burrows, Board of Commissioners, Unified Government of Wyandotte. Mr. Burrows, we have about 4 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll do my best to rush through my testimony. I have a unique perspective, having worked in the seats that my friends and former colleagues are here before me today. So it's always a privilege to stand before you. The unique perspective that was just spoken about, I believe that there's only one individual in this room who is an elected official that may have knowledge about the original Star Bonds bill, and that would be Senator Schallenberger, who was the speaker at the time when the initial Star Bonds bill came forward. It has been stated that we need to move forward with a package of incentives that will allow major sports franchises to come to Kansas. I can't disagree with that. We look at the original Star Bonds proposal and the pressure that you all feel and the questions you all may have. I have been there. Those of us that dealt with the first Star Bonds bill in reference to the amount of money that is suspect with the development plan coming forward in the public dollars. But what we must not lose sight of is the private investment that comes from that. The national and international reputation of our metropolitan community being a major sports franchise hub is extremely important and of great benefit that we can't put a price on because we haven't had the opportunity to do so. Our Sporting Kansas City has brought tremendous amount of public policy to our community in reference to how we deal with Star Bonds. I will share with you that if we want to keep the Chiefs and the Royals in the metropolitan area, Wyandotte County has a proven track record of being able to not only work with Star Bonds, but deliver on the quality of the Star Bonds project. And that is not by mistake. That is not by happenstance. It's by thorough, prudent opportunities that we take as a leadership team to put together a package that works with the Department of Commerce on the behalf of the state of Kansas. I would just state that we stand ready to work with the iconic team leadership, and let's do what we can to get this across the finish line, and let's do what we can to keep the Kansas City in the Royals and the Chiefs. Madam Chair, I hope I stayed under your timeline. There is so much more I could share. Thank you for the opportunity to share that, and I will stand for questions should there be any. I will be around. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mr. Burrows. It is time for questions. Committee members, I will limit it to one and circle back as time permits. I do have a list started already. Representative Clayton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for just the latest conferee. So Commissioner Burrows, if you could come back up. So, well, first of all, welcome back to the Kansas Legislature. I enjoyed serving with you a great deal, and I appreciate having some testimony here from someone local. I am a legislator who is a member of the Kansas City delegation. I think especially when it comes to this, we shouldn't be thinking about Johnson County versus Wyandotte County. I believe in a unified Kansas City delegation. Been having a little bit of a hard time with this. I actually support a lot of the technicalities of the bill, and I've had some of my concerns assuaged by reading this and by hearing from the revisors. But some of those concerns have come back up during what we have heard from some of our conferees. I am not particularly inclined to support this based on any sort of misogynistic sports culture. I couldn't care less. I thought Scoop and Score had something to do with ice cream. This can be forgiven. I grew up, with my parents both working for Zarda Dairy, which anyone who came from Kansas City would be familiar. What I would like you to assure me on is, as a voting member of the Kansas City delegation, if I support this, tell me a little bit more about this, what this does, bare bones, economically for the Kansas City area, in particular for the workers.
I think that's a great question. All we have to do is go back and look at what the Kansas Motor Speedway Star Bonds project did for the metropolitan community and for our community. Originally, Star Bonds was set up for economically depressed and stressed communities, which ours was. We had been the social dumping ground for years, and we took that on the chin. I remember standing before the legislature and asking not for a hand out, but a hand up, an opportunity to do that. Because with the development comes jobs, higher paying jobs, career paths for the local government, for the local residents. The local government gets an increase in value of the overall bonding authority of the community. It's a positive financial impact, not only just for our community, but this, I'll call it this border war between Johnson and Wyandotte County. We are collectively partners in the process. That state line and county line doesn't stop and have to go through a toll or anything like that to share our revenue. We are a metropolitan community, blended as we are. Social economics comes into play only when you spend your dollars. It was stated it's the discretion of the individual when and where they spend those dollars. What better way to spend it than on personal entertainment and grow our community on other people's dollars?
Senator Dahl.
Thank you. This question is for Corb Maxwell, please. Thank you, Corb. Thank you for allowing me to ask this question. You've been in economic development for some time. You know, we already got tags for the Chiefs and the Royals. We passed that already. So this way it'll make it good for having in Kansas. I was against that initially, but can you tell me in the last 40 years, has there been a Major League Baseball team or a Major League Football team that has gone defunct? The last one I can remember is the Montreal Expos, and Major League Baseball took them over and they became the Washington Nationals. So there's not been any history whatsoever of an NFL team or a Major League Baseball team going defunct and just pulling out of town.
40 years is a long time to remember every single thing.
Colts, I know.
But I'm very certain that the premise of your question is absolutely correct, in that with the 32 NFL teams and the 30 MLB teams, that these are coveted franchises. The revenues go up year after year after year, and they are about the safest bets that one can make of something that has been around for a long time and will continue to be around for a very long time and continue to increase economic activity. Thank you, Senator.
Representative Christy Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this is also for Corb. Welcome. So I wanted to just read really quickly on this one question. I did have another one. I'll hold it. This, in your testimony, you said this bill imposes zero additional tax on consumers. So I wanted to just ask or take a minute and talk about layering benefits from the state. And with the Chiefs be potentially looking at other economic incentives to layer on top of the Star Bonds, such as Peak, in which they would be able to to maintain or hold 95% of their withholding income tax. Is that something that we can expect to see as other types of state economic incentives and probably local as well?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Representative Williams, and thank you. You always give me really good ones up here to keep me on my toes. That obviously we still have a suite of other economic development tools that are available in the state of Kansas. We have not made any decisions based on those, just as this bill has not created a particular piece of property, a particular locality that we will be locating or that we will be looking at, or the option of. It also hasn't dictated any other of those tools that will be out there. Those will, of course, be things that could be negotiated as we move into finding a property, working with a specific locality, and that we're able to bring forward to the Secretary of Commerce. But our expectation has always been tempered on the fact that we would need to think through two big things, both together as a state and as a team. One, the border war legislation that has already been out there and has been does that apply? How does that apply? How would that work when you're looking at things like peak and HPIP? So I think that will be a policy consideration that will happen with the department and the secretary. And I think all of that will be the province of the legislature as well through the LCC. So that guardrail that Dan talked about, I think that will be an important component as we look to negotiate an agreement that works both for the state and for the teams. We understand this has to have a positive impact and a return on investment for the taxpayers out there. And so we'll be looking at all of those components of how do we get the project that we all want, but also show an appropriate ROI. And this is just step one in a very long process that will run out over this next year.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And this question, I guess, will be for Mr. Maxwell as well. Thank you for standing for questions, sir. A lot has been given toward the taxpayer and the concerns that many of us have for the ROI, as you just stated. Also, in your testimony, you stated that there's no intent regarding the conversation that we're having about eminent domain is the concept. That there's no intent, no desire to use eminent domain, and you're site agnostic. I want to ask a question for the concerns of some of those who might not be on the committee and might not have a voice in the conversation in the affected area. We talk about that there's going to be the one stadium and maybe a practice facility. My concern is when it comes to those property valuations, is there anything in the bill that speaks to it, or in that you can talk about the negotiations for the actual deal that will go forward to protect against predatory type of pricing of properties? I wouldn't want to see people get priced out of their land, basically have it bid on evaluation, current evaluation. And then once everything comes in, if it were to happen, that valuation goes rocket sky high and they're left high and dry. Can you please talk about that? What is those safeguards and the guardrails about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Representative, and something we think a lot about in the economic development world, right? Is you're going to do this great thing, whatever this great thing would be, and this one would be a multiple $billion-dollar investment. But does that gentrify the area? Does that increase the values and increase the property taxes or otherwise through that process? And that's something we always have to really closely consider, and that local governments are extremely heightened in. There's a part of me that says from the free market, wow, this is great. We're increasing values, and so people are seeing increase and their wealth is growing, and that is incredibly important and something we can be very, very, very proud of. But on the other side, we have to be really cognizant of pricing people out of their properties by raising property taxes. And so one of the things that we've looked with is working with municipal partners that know how to do these big projects and understand that if a big project comes around that then creates large revenue windfalls into their treasury, that they go and do that by lowering mill levies, and so that the whole county, the whole city all of the taxpayers are benefiting from it. And we've seen that historically in some locations. We can always do better between all of us in the state, but I think that would be something that would be really important for the Chiefs, and I'm sure for the Royals as well. If we're going to go do billion-dollar deals, how are we looking at bringing lots of economic activity, but letting that economic activity spur development across the cities and counties, and with that development being able to lower the tax burden so that we're returning that prosperity for everybody. Thank you.
I'm going to take the remaining people on our list, and we will move on to opponent testimony. If we do not get to your question, please hang on to it. We will get to it at the end, so all of your questions are answered. Representative Blue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Dan Murray. Dan, while you're coming up here, the biggest thing has been that by passing this bill, they're worried that our tax plan that we're here for tomorrow is that there's going to be an issue that it's not going to be as much as we are wanting, as a lot of us have noticed that we do get frustrated that the governor has vetoed every tax plan because it's too expensive. So do you believe that if we pass this bill, that there's a potential that maybe this bill gets vetoed because it does affect the tax plan in out years and so forth? If that makes sense, what I'm asking.
I think so, Representative, Madam Chair. When I said at the outset of my testimony, thank you all for being back here for the priority of getting tax relief to Kansans. I think that's why you're back for a special session. It is and should be your priority. The two are unrelated. What you do on the tax plan is not related to this particular proposal. Any new revenue that's generated through a STAR bond project that is redirected to pay back the STAR bonds is dollars that aren't counted towards any tax proposal that you're considering today. So really, they're unrelated. And I can't speak to the governor's intentions on this bill, but I can say that this brings back revenue that can help spur potentially additional tax cuts down the road. We're going to see not only with construction, the income taxes related to the jobs that are generated through the construction of these stadiums, but also the income taxes that are generated through the jobs that are brought here long term with the players both in and out of the Kansas City team. So the economic development that's developed by this will be an assistance towards, again, driving additional revenues to the SGF that can be driven towards additional tax relief, hopefully in the future. And so, in short, they're unrelated, and I think you're making two separate decisions when you come to the floor tomorrow.
Senator Reddy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for Mr. Maxwell. I appreciate all the information. I think when we build something as large as a stadium, there's also going to be ripple effects for more housing, maybe a fire station, maybe more schools, more teachers and such. So creating more jobs. My question is actually two-part. How much land does a stadium typically need? And what is the cost to build a stadium? Thank you.
Great question, Senator. I looked this up on Landglide that approximately, if you look at the land area that the Chiefs and Royals are on combined right now, is a little under 200 acres, 180 some odd acres to host two teams. I know I can speak from the Chiefs' perspective that one thing that is incredibly important in anything that we do is the tailgate culture of Kansas City is like nothing else in the National Football League, and frankly, like nothing else in any of the major sporting leagues around the United States or around the world. And Clark and Mark and the rest of the kingdom would never want to lose that. So any deal that we would look at would include not only appropriate ground for the stadium, but enough that you can have 20,000 parking spaces or more so that you can keep that incredibly special tailgating culture that we've had in Kansas City for so many decades. So it would be roughly something in the magnitude of you need several hundred acres, and that's just for the stadium itself. We would love to see the ability And the whole bill is premised on doing additional economic development in around that area, being able to have hotels, being able to have retail, being able to have mixed use. All of those things are important and are drivers of revenue. So I think the acreage that we would talking about would be many hundreds of acres that would be required to do a stadium. Cost, we don't have a specific property in mind. We don't have a stadium designed. We don't have any of those pieces put together, but our best estimate in the vacuum is that you're looking at $2 billion to build a brand new domed stadium to play NFL games in.
Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not sure if it's Mr. Murray or Mr. Maxwell, this question, but since you're up, I'll just pose it to you. Frankly, my constituents, in the Midwest or central west part of the state could probably care less if it's over in Missouri or in Kansas. They're going to travel 6-7 hours no matter what. What they don't want to see is it becomes the Salt Lake City Chiefs or something like that. So I do believe that this is something, even though it isn't going to necessarily affect my constituents, that it's important to them. But the question is, and it kind of goes back a little bit to Representative Williams and Representative Blue's question on the income tax, because that's where it does affect my constituents. Because if we bring in more income tax, then that helps my constituents. So it does concern me that possibly could be, other programs like Peak or that would diminish that. But can you tell me, we haven't heard anything today on estimates of what, if it was 100%, what are the estimates of income tax that could be brought in simply with the players, the staff, other players around the league?
So I know that the information on the Missouri side is roughly $30 million are sent a year to Jefferson City and income taxes currently on the Missouri side. And that is growing at a rate as it grows with the salary cap, right, of growing at roughly 10% a year every year for as far back as we can see, that the 53 players are making approximately $250 million, and that continues to go up. And that doesn't include any of the executives, the coaching staff, the rest of the team out there. I think the overall payroll is close to $400 million currently, and that continues to grow much faster than the rate of economic growth. So I think we can do basic math of what our tax rates are as you guys work through them this week and beyond, of what that would then be able to bring in. The other point that I think is super important, Representative, and to answer both of your questions, is remember that all salary is paid on a per game basis, right? And so you have all of the other visiting teams that are coming and always paying in those taxes as well. And I'm not saying that Peak will be used or any of that. As I said before, that hasn't been looked at. That is many steps down the road as we work through all of this. But the important thing is visiting teams, broadcasters, all of those others that are paid substantial salaries and come to these games, those would never be incented in any form or fashion. All of that would be collected by the state and create substantial economic lift for your constituents and other constituents that are on the other side of the state many hours away.
Madam Chair, if I may, so that part of it is, there's nothing that we need to change in our laws in order for that to happen. Because I've been told, that only happens if we change something. So
I don't believe that's the case. Everything that I've understood is that it would be sourced, that is then Kansas income. And because that's Kansas income, it would be sourced to that location and would pay income tax on it. It's the way it works in all of the rest of the NFL, and I believe the MLB and others, as when we've looked at it in the past.
Okay.
Senator Schallenberger. Representative Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Corp, I want to thank you for being here. I want to dig in a little bit for what you said as far as verifying the cost. incurred, for like the additional security and all of that. I do know at one time that was happening in Wyandotte, but when I asked that question of the UG last week, my understanding that may no longer be happening. And so if you could verify that, I think that would be helpful just to know that is a way for local government to recoup some of those costs. I know that helps at the actual facility, but I guess my concern still remains is just making sure that there is some kind of revenue source, because every developer says it's going to, there's going to be zero tax burden, but we all know that there are additional costs there. And in Wyandotte County, 70% of our workforce comes from outside of our county, which then, provides a real challenge for us. We produce the highest income jobs in the entire state in our county, but we are still very much at the bottom of per capita income. So I very much want to make sure, I'm very excited about this opportunity, but I want to make sure that we aren't further burdening our taxpayers. And, if there's some guardrails, and I think it would be helpful just to know if there is that reimbursement back. So if you could just verify that, I think that would be good.
It's a great point, Representative Curtis, and you may have more up-to-date information than I do. I know I looked at it in the past, and that was paid for all of that additional security and otherwise of deals that were done in Wyandotte County. But you also know how strenuous and how thick these development agreements get and how they're negotiated by all local governments in anywhere that we would locate, but including in Wyandotte County. And so I understand that the local representatives would have a substantial interest in that, and that would be something we would have to prove up. But I can tell you that from the NFL's perspective, we are already making those payments in Jackson County. So that is a line item that is in the budget, accounted for, and we would be ready and know of paying those types of costs would be something we would be expected to pay. So I don't think there'll be any daylight between us and the local governments or the state on making sure and understanding that development needs to pay for development, and that is not the burden of the taxpayer that's already been there before. So I think we can get there on all of that in a way that is appropriate and helpful for both the county or the city and the teams. Thank you.
Committee, we're going to move on now. That's the end of the list, but if you do come up with additional questions, please make note of those. We will get those answered. I will draw your attention to written only proponent testimony that is available electronically. We will now take opponent testimony. They will have the same 45 minutes, and then we will take questions after all opponents have testified. We will start with Michael Austin, Legislative Director, Americans for Prosperity, Kansas. Welcome, Mr. Austin.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. In the interest of time and the conferees, I hope you would allow me to put a timer on to make sure that I stick to my time. Okay. Thank you. My name is Michael Austin. I am the Legislative Director for Americans for Prosperity, Kansas. As some of you know my background, I pledge to be a free market economist, which means I do what I can to try to advocate for policies where government gets out of the way and allows the private sector to work and to flourish. I've had a storied history here in Kansas, but what I'm really most proud of is representing taxpayers. And that's one of the beautiful things I think about representing Americans for Prosperity is while you may have advocates for the corporate community, you may have advocates for unions, you may have advocates for any other type of particular constituency, we are the grassroots organizations that knock on doors and talk to voters about what they care about. And so what they care about, first and foremost, while of course they like the Chiefs, is tax relief. So I want to commend this body for finally coming together for an agreement to finally get tax relief for everyone, including Senator O'Shea Little One, because he's most certainly going to need that tax relief when he gets older. Well, it goes without saying, though, the fight that it took to have tax relief was a long and arduous one. We have the Senate president here. He can most certainly attest to that. It took a lot of conversations. We traveled to 11 cities, talked to so many different constituents, talked to so many different business owners, local government officials, elected officials themselves. And it took roughly 2 years, right, for us to finally get an agreement that we could finally have income, sales, and property tax relief for all. Let's contrast that with the conversation that we're having today. Because we've had some out-of-state developers who wanted to, have the Chiefs come here. That's put to the side. Nothing negative about that. But we're having a conversation in a single-day special session, figuring out how we can loan out $1 billion at least of taxpayer funds to build 2 stadiums here in Kansas, most likely in the KC region. Do we think we should probably give ourselves a little bit more time to think about it? If it took us 2 years to talk about tax relief, why are we spending one single day to give a taxpayer bailout to some sort of out-of-state developer? That's not fair. And one I want you to take away from my testimony is fairness. Kansans deserve relief. And thanks to the work of this body, we can finally give it to them, roughly $400 to $500 million of relief. But we are basically giving them a quarter compared to the dollar that we are giving to possibly 2 out-of-state billion-dollar developers. Whether you pass tax relief first or not, I will argue there's more work to be done. I will, of course, draw you to my testimony. You've heard many, of course, proponents come up here and talk about the economic benefits of having the Chiefs here and all the different effects that it can have. But I want to preface it with this. There's a reason why economists are called the dismal scientists. And it's that whenever there's somebody talking about pie in the sky dreams and all the different possibilities, you have to have an economist to say, here's what actually happens. Here are the facts. Here are the decisions that human beings actually make when they're faced with these policies. And the facts of the matter simply show that star bonds or super TIFs, super tax increment financing districts, simply do not work. Of course, you don't need me to tell you that. You have your own studies yourself. Your own Division of Post Audit, of course, back in 2020, looked at that. You've heard it from plenty of news reports already. I've done what I could to make sure we were all aware that star bonds have an 80% failure rate. Well, what about the 3 successes? Heartland Park, Hutchinson Salt Mine, the Motorsports Park in NASCAR. Well, let's remember, Heartland Sports in Topeka is closed permanently. It's up for auction. The other 2 ones, Hutchinson Mine and the NASCAR Raceway. The NASCAR Raceway is the only one paid off. So are you telling me that you want to dissuade about 10 different star bonds not getting the tax revenue so that you can just focus on the one and hope that the Chiefs are going to, or excuse me, hope that a Chiefs Stadium or a Royal Stadium will do that for you? We can do better than that. We can do our due diligence. We can ask the right questions. We can make sure that we get the right answers. And if it truly comes down to this, then let's have that conversation. But be realistic. We can't get this done in a day. They talked about the economic booms that, of course, can come from having a stadium here in Kansas. But I want to let you know this. We've already been experiencing that boom. Kansas City is not Kansas City, Missouri. It is the Kansas City metropolitan area. Johnson County is growing because Kansas City is growing. Wyandotte is growing because Kansas City is growing. We have already been experiencing those benefits. So if they're telling you that you're going to see roughly $1 billion of economic impact from having a stadium, you have to remember you're already experiencing it today. Not only that, but if star bonds were supposed to work, then we should see that growth in our economic history. And the fact of the matter is it's not there. In the testimony that I provided to you, I decided to look at GDP, economic activity for the last 20 years, looking at arts, entertainment, recreation, retail trade, accommodation, that's hotels, and of course, food services. We've had star bonds littered all across Kansas for the last 20 years. If star bonds are the economic game changer, if they're the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that some people claim it to be, then why isn't Kansas growing at the national average? I'll tell you why. Because they don't work. Do you know what works? Broad-based lowering income, sales, and property taxes. You want to grow an economy? Then you have to lower taxes and costs for everyone, not just those who are your political favorites or who can throw you a nice little steak dinner in Lawrence. We have to do better than that. Another thing I also wanted to bring up is the economic feasibility study. The claim that because of the feasibility study on the Star Bond statute, we can finally have proper checks and balances. But since we've had that statute in place, we have never had a proper economic feasibility study. I know because I used to work in the Department of Revenue, and I was never asked to do an economic feasibility study. In fact, working in the Department of Revenue at the focusing on income tax, the Department of Commerce would do handshake after handshake for different economic development deals and then ship it off to the Department of Revenue to figure out whether it works, but they never cared what I had to say. You have lobbyists and you have individuals coming up here telling you that the world's going to be great. It's going to smell like rainbows and ice cream. But in reality, they're not paying any consequences for being wrong. Kansas families are. And the fact of the matter is taxpayers are on the hook. I teach economics at the Washburn University School of Business. And one of the easiest, or not easiest, but one of the first economic public finance concepts I teach is something called tax incidence, which means just because you have a legislation or a law that says who pays the tax or who doesn't pay the tax has no relation to who actually bears the burden. And in this particular case, when you have a Star Bond that is paid by with state taxpayer dollars, you are effectively paying. How? Why? Because that sales tax could have been used to give you other benefits, like lowering the sales tax rate. Or that local sales tax revenue could have been used so that you don't have to have another community improvement district. You would naturally have those revenues coming in. In the testimony that I provided to you, if Kansas never had Star Bonds, our state sales tax rate would be close to 6%. That is what taxpayers are paying. That is what taxpayers are giving up so that we can have a Star Bond. And that is why I say taxpayers are always on the hook. Whenever it is a subsidy, it will always be there. When someone says the state credit line or state credit rating is not going to be on the hook, I do have considerable problems with that. And one of the problems I have is simply the fact that you cannot legislate what your credit rating is going to be. If we were able to legislate what our credit rating was going to be, then Kansas wouldn't have had a lower credit rating down when our spending was going way beyond our revenues. Credit ratings are on the hook. Bondholders can have repercussions. It happened in Platte County and Zona Rosa. And because it happened in Platte County and Zona Rosa, there were cities here in Kansas that decided to pay back bondholders because they didn't want their credit to go down to junk status. We talk about guardrails, checks and balances. But then if I look at this bill proposal here, I don't see many guardrails or checks and balances. One of the first things I notice here, stadium Star Bonds are not subject to the Kansas Open Meetings Act. Stadium Star Bonds are not subject to KORA. The Secretary of Commerce can establish a Star Bond in a city or county without providing public notice or a hearing. Where's the transparency? Where are the guardrails in that? Eminent domain. You had the prior proponent conferee telling you that they're going to do their best not to take the land from families and from businesses, and they're going to do what they can to even provide property tax relief in order to do it. But that's not a justification for your property tax rights being taken away. That's not justification for you being forced to sell your livelihood, forced to sell your land, forced to move your family so that you can get property tax? How about you don't take my land in the first place? How about when you come to me and ask for my land, you sell it to me at post-development prices instead of pre-development prices? And that way, even if the price value goes up, I don't suffer any difference. We want to talk about an agreement must be approved by the LCC, but I just told you about the Open Meetings Act and court requests. So I'm not really sure whether that is going to be transparent or not. If it's taxpayer money, why shouldn't we know what's happening in these deals? And then finally, they say that they want to let the free market decide. If the free market was deciding, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. If the free market was deciding, we would be having a conversation about how to lower regulations, how to lower taxes, how to make it much easier to run a business or raise a family. And then from that alone, the Kansas City Chiefs would love to come here because we would have a dynamic, vibrant, and growing economy. The fact that we're having this conversation is an implicit admission that Kansas is getting too expensive. It is. The fact we are having this conversation today is an implicit admission that Kansas tax codes are too much, that we're paying too much in energy prices, that our home values are rising too fast and we're taking property tax out of it. So the solution is to give your tax dollars to a single developer? No. The solution is to reduce spending And from that reduction in spending, you can find a way to reduce taxes. But think about it this way. Even if you may not be aligned with me on these political views, how about this? A star bond, at least before this bill hearing, used to have its local sales tax also contribute to its payment. What does that mean? That means less money for schools at a county level or a local level. That means less money for city services. It's good to know that the Kansas City Chiefs and the billionaire out-of-state developers will pay for police and fire, but will they help fix potholes? Will they help widen roads? I don't know. But that's a question that's for you to consider. And it's a question I don't think that you can easily answer in a day. Last but most certainly not least, I have to speak to something a bit personal. As some of you may know, I'm actually from New York. I've been here for 20 years, but I still got that dog in me sometimes. And being a New Yorker, one of the best teams I thought were the New York Giants. Where are the Giants? They're not in New York, but I still had pride in them. When I came to Kansas in 2003, I said, who's Dante Culpepper? I have no idea who that is. But I slowly grew to learn and love the Chiefs. I don't care where they are. It doesn't matter to me whether they are 30 minutes closer or 30 minutes far away. If I choose to go to Arrowhead, that is my choice. But what we're doing here is we're basically saying that everybody in the state does not have a choice. You're paying a high state sales tax rate to bring the Chiefs 30 minutes closer. And I think that when you do your due diligence and you look at the 50, 40 years of 100 plus economic research studies that simply say star bonds do not work, they just redirect activity, you'll find that there's a better way to do this. And I hope you find it soon. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now turn attention to Linnell Griffith. Citizen Committee, you should have received the link to the online testimony. I do not believe you have the written testimony from the next two conferees, but it is available online and we'll get you a hard copy as soon as possible. So Linnell Griffith, are you here? Okay, we'll move on to Dave Traubert, CEO, Kansas for Prosperity. Welcome to committee, Mr. Traubert.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Dave Traubert, I'm with Kansas Policy Institute, not Kansans for Prosperity. We get confused a lot. That's okay. I want to explain, you have my testimony. I just left copies here. I want to go through some of the reasons why we oppose this star bond proposal. First of all, star bonds and stadium subsidies have a poor track record. There's even the left-leaning Brookings Institute has done a study and found that the hyped advantages just aren't there. The Taxpayer Protection Alliance looked at at NFL stadiums in particular between 1995 and 2015 and concluded that there was no real job growth as a result of about $7 billion in subsidies. Now, the reason that these subsidies, and it's not just star bonds, but particularly with star bonds, the reason that they don't work is that they generally just shift economic activity. We had a study of 2 star bond projects conducted by an economist at the University of Kansas. He looked at 2 projects in Wichita. And what he concluded was it really just shifted activity from one side of the city to another. And, you know, we all have about the same amount of money, whether the Chiefs are here or not. Our entertainment budget doesn't change as individuals. And so when you spend money somewhere else, it's money you didn't spend, you would have spent elsewhere. And there's a loss to that. There's a loss to the businesses where you won't be spending money. There's also, that's a cost to business. There's also a cost to taxpayers because when that money shifts, if we're spending money at businesses now, dining, retail, and so forth, that money is generating sales tax that goes to the general fund. If that money gets spent in a star bond district, it's going to pay off debt. Now, there's a loss to the state general fund because the money wasn't going there, it got diverted. We hear a lot of talk about the $1 billion or so of economic activity, but we don't have anything to verify that with. We asked Scoop and Score to provide their math. Show us how you arrived at $1 billion of economic activity. Nothing was forthcoming. Part of the reason may be that when the economists look at that information, they don't account for the unseen consequences of money shifting from one place to another. Spending that would have been done here is over here. That's a cost. That's not new money. That's just a shift. You can't count that. So we don't really know, and that's not uncommon for people looking for subsidies to not want to show the math. But that's just the cold hard facts. Subsidies are not going to resolve our economic situation. Kansas is in its 5th straight decade of economic stagnation. We keep falling farther and farther behind the nation in job growth, in real GDP growth. And we've been trying the subsidy game for a long time, and it's just not making a difference. There needs to be a different approach to look at why aren't we growing, and look at those barriers like taxes and utility rates and regulations, and do something about the root causes. And finally, I want to mention that because this is another impact, demonstration of taxpayers not getting the benefit. We all know how much growth there was, activity from the Speedway and from the Legends, but all that money didn't really benefit taxpayers because Wyandotte County increased property tax 301% since the late 90s. That's 3.5 times the combined rate of inflation and population growth. That's almost always the case. When there's a benefit, it's going to the local government. It's not going to the taxpayers. And with that, I'll be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, Mr. Trobert. I'm going to try, is Linnell Griffith here? Okay, we will move on to committee questions for the opponents. Are there any questions for the opponents? Representative Probst.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It doesn't matter to me who answers this. It can be Mr. Austin or Mr. Schreiber, but I'm glad we raised the point about showing math. So I may have a couple of questions. Mr. Schreiber's chart shows this 300% increase in property tax. But what you don't have is, do we have anything to compare that to, like what that was in the other parts of the state? Was there any other outstanding dynamics that caused that increase? I feel like this is incomplete information.
Thank you for the question, Representative. That is much higher than most parts of the state, certainly higher than the state average. There's only one thing that really drives how much any government entity taxes, and it's how much it spends. The more you spend, the more you have to tax. And it's simply a growth in spending that is driving the growth in taxes.
But the market values also determine an increase in property taxes.
That's one variable, but the local authorities can change the mill rate in order to prevent that large tax increase. Wyandotte County, last 2 years, 27% tax increase, property tax, 2-year period.
Yes, nationally, property values have been increasing drastically over the last several years.
But that would imply that there's an entitlement to government to collect that money.
You're getting into a philosophical discussion.
I'm going to remind that this is a time to question, not debate. So please keep in mind, let's ask questions and have the conferees answer. So do you have another question, Representative Probst?
I think well, again, it's all about information. And I do have a question maybe for Mr. Austin about his assumption that the tax rate would be lower if we had not done star bonds. And I guess I feel like your comparison here, what you're really doing is showing that if there is a problem at all with star bonds, it's that it's been diluted and used too frequently and used out of its nature. The nature of star bonds as it was created was to do exactly what we're talking about. And the legislative post-audit work indicated that there's only 3 projects that have met the criteria of star bonds in terms of bringing out-of-state travelers. But it feels like you're trying to apply this to this as well. So what are you trying to convince me of that says this project is the same as these other smaller projects that haven't been as successful?
No, what I'm trying to convince you of is out of the many different star bond projects, they have all varied in terms of its scope, the type of entertainment district, the type of experience it would give to a customer. And despite all of those very different experiences, they've all failed. You want to talk about how this is this is exactly what a star bond has been for. But with prior conferees, I believe it was either the chamber or it was Dan who's talked about there are two other states that have star bonds, Nevada and Illinois, I believe. According to those 2 states, they haven't used star bonds in over a decade. So you have analysis here in Kansas that says star bonds, no matter what type of project, is a high likelihood of failing. And then you have Illinois and Nevada who also have star bonds, but they feel like they don't need to use them. So I do question whether star bonds are truly the right tool for the job, considering that no other 47 states have decided to take them on. And from our own history, it simply does not work.
Senator Reddy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Austin can stay for this question, or Mr. Tabbert. It was alluded to how star bonds fail. In Manhattan, we do have a star bond district, and it was the Flint Hills Discovery Center was as the tourism spot, but it was a catalyst to so many more businesses to come in that would not have thought of Manhattan as a place to make it a hub for economic development, but it has definitely had an economic impact, not only in the city of Manhattan, but throughout our county. So I just wanted to see, when you say all star bonds have failed, what are you referring to as failed?
Sure. Well, I think first thing is we can look at your Department of Division of Post Audit's own definition, right, which I believe referred to the Department of Commerce's definition of tourism. So they said that they did not meet the Department of Commerce's definition of tourism. So that's one definition I think that can fall under that term of failure. What I will also say is I will also ask you to hearken back to either my presentation or even the prior conferee, Dave Troppert, where we talked about star bonds don't create new activity, they redirect activity. And a really good sign of that could actually come back to the Division of Post Audit. They did another study, I don't know if you were aware of, this wasn't in 2020, this was back in 2008. I believe it was August 2008. They looked at the Village West Star Bond and they tried to assess what were the economic impacts from that. And particularly they noticed how, of course, Nebraska Furniture Mart came into that Village West Star Bond, and people like to definitely tout that as a particular success. But what Division of Post Audit found was when Nebraska Furniture Mart came into that star bond, and they came into that star bond so that they could, get that, arguably better deal and arguably better deal. The surrounding Kansas counties saw a third of their small businesses close, particularly businesses in relation to retail trade. In other words, when Nebraska Furniture Mart came into that Village West, people decided to no longer shop at their home furniture store, as an example, and they decided to shop at Nebraska Furniture Mart instead. Now, that happens in the private market all the time. I can't necessarily fault that at all. Well, the difference here is that started because of a star bond. That started because government decided to put its finger on the scale in order to create that type of activity and move people from one Kansas county to another. Moreover, if you think about it, you had a lot of customers that were buying furniture, TVs, desks in counties that were sending sales tax to government. And then they decided to purchase their same items at a Nebraska Furniture Mart in which the sales tax was not going to government. It wasn't going to local services. It wasn't going to state services. So in that particular example, you have star bonds redirecting activity, but at the same time, you also have the loss of tax revenue that could be for either lowering taxes, if you're on center right, or at least providing better government services at the local or the state level. And that's the unfair role of government picking winners and losers and the economic effects it can have.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That list was a little bit shorter than I expected. I thought I was going to be sitting around waiting for a while. All right. Michael, I want to kind of copy off of the last question. Failures, that's a strong term to use. So I want to get a little bit more clarity on what you're talking about when you said all but 3 have failed. Is it tourism that we're talking about, or are we talking about solvency of the bond?
I was speaking to at least the definition that was provided by the Division of Post Audit, which would be Department of Commerce's tourism. And then when we want to talk about payment of the bond, it's not exactly overlapping, but I do think that there's enough overlap that I felt comfortable including that as well.
So you're claiming both?
Yes, that's what I said. It's not in every circumstance, but I felt in enough.
Right. I think there's been a grand
because I think there's only been 2 star bonds that have technically been paid off. Is that correct? And out of those 2 star bonds, there's been about 23 different projects. So that's a failure rate even bigger than 80%, but let's just assume it's an 80% failure rate.
So you're claiming that because they're not paid off currently, that's a failure?
If it takes...
Even if it was rebonded, for example?
If it was rebonded?
Right.
I don't understand your question. I'm sorry.
Well, if they re-let the money out for another project, is that paid off, or is that a new project? Which one are we talking about here?
I'm talking about that out of the 23 projects, only 2 have been paid off. The rest are still either ongoing, and some of them have a relatively shorter window of being paid off. Some of them have about 100 years that they're going to be paid off. I didn't make a distinction. I just said how many are paid off and how many are not, and that's a higher failure rate than even the Department of Commerce's tourism guidelines that the Division of Budget had used.
Right, and that was another one, the Division of Post Audit. When you talked about the Division of Post Audit, what was the question that they were asked when they then came back with the determination of only 3 having failed?
That I cannot remember. That I cannot remember off the top of my head, but that's something I can easily get back to you with.
Right. I was cheating. I knew the answer to this one. They were talking about tourism. And it was, are we drawing people from outside the state at a high enough level to justify this as a tourism or economic development tool? I don't think that's what we're looking at with the stadiums, however. Would you agree with me on that tourism isn't exactly what we're looking for?
Then what are you looking for? I thought a star bond was supposed to encourage tourism, arts, recreation, accommodation, economic development. Well, then that's a term that I have not heard until today, because for the past 20 years, we've been using star bonds in order to create tourism and create either increased retail trade, arts, entertainment, recreation. There have been a number of bills over time that have tried to expand that use of star bonds to things that have nothing to do with retail trade. I remember standing here at this desk and trying to argue that expanding a star bond to include corporate headquarters is not going to pay off the debt. And so when you're talking about economic development, I think your concern should be about whether it can be paid off. And the best way to pay that off is to, well, honestly, find a way to make sure consumers pay for it. But if you're expanding or changing the definition to something that has nothing to do with consumer sales, I think that is fraught with failure. Sorry to use that term again, but it's going to set up these projects to fail.
We're going to take that offline and debate that further on the floor if need be, but we're going to move on to Vice Chair Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had several questions along those same lines, and your testimony and some of the things that you've tweeted about. What is your definition of solvent? You're an economist, so solvency is what?
At least on the path of paying back a bond in a reasonable sort of time. And since the star bond is roughly 20 years, I think that's a good ballpark.
Okay, so only 3 out of 16 bonds are solvent, leaving the Kansas taxpayers to pay the rest. Do you think that might be a little bit misleading?
In which way?
All of our star bonds, with the exception of one, maybe, are not on track or are all on track to pay themselves off.
When you
early.
say on track, as an example, Prairie Fire is technically on track. It'll pay off that bond in about 150 years. So I did not make such distinction. So when you say on track, you're going to have to add in additional language. I did
Every
not.
single star bond that we have will pay off within its allotted time, except for one. And by the way, it's back on track. It's now generating enough sales tax to pay for itself, most likely. But 80% failure rate and soluble coming from an economist is pretty a dangerous word to use when you're trying to debate a bill like this. We're trying to bring something grand to the state of Kansas and increase SGF with income tax and whatever else. But it seems like, and you and I usually are on the same page on star bonds, by the way. This one in particular, we're not. But it seems like you dislike star bonds so much that you're distorting the facts consistently. I mean, we all know that we have laws that you cannot take land or property from anyone in the state of Kansas for an economic development issue unless there's an act of the legislature. And I think it might even be 2/3. But you continually, you even said it in your testimony today, don't take my land. Well, we're not. There's nothing in this bill that the legislator is voting on that will allow somebody to take land. There?
That's correct, because it's already in the bill, and it's already in statute, and your bill doesn't address it. It doesn't remove it. Eminent domain is still there, which means you could force a family or a business to sell their property or their livelihood, right, for the use of that private development.
Not for economic development. We have a specific statute for that.
Yes, it's in the star bond statute, correct.
Also, one of the things you were saying was the state or the cities are on the hook constantly. We had one star bond. You quoted it, and you quoted the actual statute. But what you didn't tell everybody was that statute ties back strictly to one star bond in the Topeka area, because they came to the legislature and it took an act of the legislature to add that to the bill in order for Topeka to back those bonds, because otherwise the star bond bill does not allow for that. Why is it that you think that you can draw from that statute a direct line to every other star bond project and say that the cities are on the hook when they're not?
I never said the cities were on the hook. I said taxpayers are on the hook. What I've said was that the state law allows if a star bond cannot get the sales tax revenue to be paid with other revenues, and I simply pointed to statute. If you don't like that, then we should have had a bill or an amendment to change that. But the fact of the matter is that it's there in law and it can be used. Whether it has been used or used often, that's a question for the body to consider. You also talked about bringing in income taxes, from having the stadium here. And I think it's important to also talk about the math as well. We had a prior conferee talk about the max payroll for the Chiefs would be about $400 million. Well, remember, our state income tax rate is about 4 to 5 on average, the average cumulative tax rate. In other words, if all employees decided to live full-time and work here in Kansas, the most Kansas would ever get would be about 4 million. Not tens of millions, not 30 million, but 4. And I think it's also important to represent that fact properly.
I'm not privy to what their payroll is, but I know they paid the state of Missouri last year $26 million, and that was from the NFL. The NFL, you realize the NFL pays these players, and they withhold the tax in the state they play in. So every game that's played will get income tax on.
Speaking of withhold the tax, I think Representative Williams made a really good case that if the Chiefs come here, they might make peak a part of their incentive option, which means that $4 million could even decrease further.
Okay, it's not in this current bill, but
no. Once again, it's in statute. It's already here.
I'll let some other people take a stab at this, and I have several other questions in the future.
Okay, before we move on to our next committee member, I will say that we are passing out information on star bonds. There's been a lot of talk about, are they solvent? Are they not? How many projects have done this or that? We are getting the factual information for committee members. We do also have, I believe, Mr. North available, who will answer any additional questions. Again, we do not want to get into debate, but questions to get to the facts of this proposed legislation. So please keep that in mind. With that, we'll move to Representative Penn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very quickly, I'd like to ask a question or two of Mr. Austin, please. And I'd like to, as he approaches, I'd like to apologize to Dave Charbert. I had to step away to the Little Warriors room and missed your presentation, but I do appreciate your handout. For Mr. Austin, how you doing? I wanted to go to the top of your testimony. You have 5 bullet points up here at the top. It says on number 1, star bonds, and at the end of it, you say you make it harder to make the state's tax climate competitive. And my question is, are we doing that on a tax bill right now after sustaining multiple vetoes?
Your question is, are we doing what we can in that particular effort to make the state tax climate more competitive? Well, a tax cut's a tax cut. I would give you that. I would say yes. Though, of course, I would question if we're doing a star bond that's going to cost at least $2 to $3 billion. Okay. That's sales tax of $2 to $3 billion. That is going to a particular developer. Meanwhile, all families and businesses are getting,
I'm sorry, I have
$100 in terms of relief.
So when we're talking about, are we doing the state's tax climate to make it more competitive? Your statement was that we have to do it with income tax, sales tax, property tax relief. Those were the things that you said for fairness and relief, doing it broad-based. I believe we're doing that in our tax bill that we will consider tomorrow. The next point that I'd like to bring in is, Madam Chair, on bullet point number 2. Bullet point number 3, star bonds have coincided with Kansas's falling farther behind the national average than before star bonds. And Mr. Austin, is that an issue of correlation or causality that star bonds, do they cause Kansas to fall behind, or has that trend that you've seen happened at the same time as star bonds have come into play?
That's a great question. To answer that, I would say this. Correlation does not mean causation, but causation does mean correlation. In other words, if over 20 years we can't at least get closer to the national average, then it should invite the question of, are we doing the right things? Should we be doing something different? And that is at least what my testimony is trying to provide. And hopefully, I believe other conferees would have done that as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll ask my final question and I'll be quiet. Mr. Austin, on the last piece of the 5th bullet point, you said if a star bond district includes more than football or baseball stadium, it will divert economic activity and damage small businesses activity outside that star bond district. My question is basically, as I asked the other conferees on the proponency, if the Chiefs organization or the Royals, if they picked a field right now that isn't doing anything, well, I think they said 100 acres or whatever the case might be, and there's no economic activity going on in that space right now, as we've had free market principles reign, no one has made a play for that land. There's no economic activity generating. You said that once they get there, if there's any income that is raised and then it goes off, that is a missed opportunity for taxation across the state. How are we supposed to look at that if there was zero before, when we had every governing activity happening, but no one has bitten at the apple? So now if you use the star bond tool and call it as you may, 2017, I think you said Senator Schallenberger helped create this. If it's now in place, why would we not utilize it to bring economic activity to an area that previously and heretofore has had zero? So no one is not missing anything because there was zero, and multiplication by zero is still zero. I'm just trying to figure out, how is it that we want to keep doing what we've been doing and keep getting what we've been getting?
Thank you very much, Representative Penn. And that's because businesses move into the Star Bond. They don't grow out of nothing. And that's the point that I'm trying to get my presentation to hopefully get that message through. When it happened at Nebraska Furniture Mart was a new business that came in. Of course, it came from someplace out of state, but then you also had activity that moved from one county to another. And so on the example of Nebraska Furniture Mart, furniture sales dropped. If we're going to talk about entrepreneurship, you had small businesses going out of work because customers decided to capitalize on Nebraska Furniture Mart. And that only happened because government decided to put its finger on the scale. To your point, though, about if it's on a arguable green field, right, and there's nothing there before, what does that mean? Well, part of my answer, of course, is that activity moves in from other parts of Kansas, so it doesn't come from nothing. It comes from someplace, and now the other place is dealing with a loss. But then I guess I want to say this. If you were to restrict a Star Bond to just the stadium, admissions, jerseys, hot dogs, hamburgers, and whatever, and use those sales tax, beer, and whatnot to pay for a Star Bond, it would work very similar to a business loan, right? If the Hunt family wants to do a loan and pay it that way, that's fine. That's what businesses do each and every day. But a Star Bond doesn't do that, does it? It encompasses other areas for other commercial activity as well. And that is in particular a problem because it cannibalizes entrepreneurship. You want to talk about fairness. This is effectively saying that we have a referee that instead of two teams trying to beat each other for the amusement of the fans, we have both teams trying to lobby the referee so that they can get a call made in their favor. And that's effectively what we have going on here. If you want to keep a Star Bond to the unique area of the stadium district, by all means, let's have an amendment and consider it. But the Chiefs won't accept that because they want to pass on the cost to taxpayers and keep all of the profit.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I have a question for you, Michael, if you want to stay up there. I appreciate your testimony, and I'm looking at this from an economic perspective. So regionally, we have had a lot of economic activity come to the Kansas City area. I think of the NFL draft. I think of World Cup. I think of even the Taylor Swift Eras Tour, which happened at Arrowhead Stadium. It was, I think Visit KC said that it brought in $48 million of economic impact in 2 days. What, as an economist, what would be the economic impact if we lost the Chiefs or if we lost the Royals both together?
So that question is if, let's say, the Chiefs were to leave, the question would then become, would you still have Kansans spending money? And I would argue yes. If the economic impact is roughly $1 billion, let's put that into proper context. $1 billion in terms of the state economy. The state economy as of the end of 2023 was $180 billion. In other words, if you took the economic impact as a share of the Kansas economy, you're talking about less than 1%. So I know we're talking about the big economic impact, but in actuality terms, the Kansas economy is far bigger. So I really think it's important that we understand what do we see? We see the shiny penny, we see the shiny new stadium, we see all the effects that we think come from that stadium. But what I would love to ask for this body is to consider what are we giving up in order to have it? And we are giving up higher sales tax. We're giving up taxes that can go for local services. And we're, of course, making anyone pay that higher sales tax rate for that.
I appreciate your answer. For me, I just look at the Buffalo Bills fans that stay at Hotel KC. I think of the San Francisco 49ers who, travel to our area and think they're spending dollars and they're coming to Kansas City to spend their money here. And so I think of an economic driver. I have to take that into consideration of seeing how this could impact not only Kansas, but our region as a whole if we do lose these two teams. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I would agree. And you're making a great point. You're seeing what you see. And what I'm asking you is to also include what's being given up so that you can see that. Please tell me I'm done.
Committee, do we have any more questions for the opponents? Seeing none, thank you so much.
Thank
we
you.
Will now move on to, I will draw your attention, there was no written only opponent testimony, committee. We do have, and I believe a hard copy has been passed out to you, neutral written only from Will Lawrence, Chief of Staff from the Governor's Office. I encourage you to take a look at that. with that committee of any of our conferees, either proponents or opponents or the revisor? Are there questions that have not been addressed? Vice Chair Tarwater.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question for Bob North.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Co-Chair Tarwater. I'm Bob North, Chief Counsel at the Kansas Department of Commerce, and thank you for sticking around through this proceeding today.
Thank you. I know you didn't have a presentation here, but today, but I know that you're heavily involved in the Star Bond projects, or all of them, probably from many years. But I was wanting to get an explanation from you on. There's been a lot of speculation over a single Star Bond that was slow paying in Overland Park, and I had a conversation with you on the phone the other day, and you gave me a great deal of comfort on it. And I was hoping that you could kind of go through where we are on that particular Star Bond, and then maybe opine as to where we are in general on all Star Bonds, because it's been said that they're insolvent, 80% of them. So I'd like you maybe to kind of address that.
Sure. I appreciate the opportunity, and committee members. I think the project that Representative Tarwater is speaking about is the Prairie Fire Project in Overland Park. And to his point, in 2020, which is when post-audit, about the time of its review of that project, it was generating about $2.2 or $2.3 million of sales tax. Fast forward to the last reporting period, and that's up to almost $5 million. So that project got off to a slow start due to general economic conditions. There was a little bit at the tail end of a recession. It went through COVID. It went through the loss of a primary retail driver, a grocery store, and there were also some issues with the movie theater that was in that location. Since that time, since the post-audit report, there's been significant new attractions and entertainment venues and restaurants in that district, and it is now producing enough sales tax that it can make debt service on those bonds. Because of the run-up to that, the first 6 or 7 years of that district, the project got behind. It continues to evolve. A Star Bond term is 20 years. So at the end of the 20-year term of that Star Bond project, if the current growth rates were to continue, then the bondholders are going to be made whole. Everyone will receive their principal and interest payments on those bonds. So it's unfair to take a snapshot view of a project that's got a 20-year lifespan and draw a conclusion based upon that particular point in time. A lot of these projects they're large projects. They take a significant length of time to mature. And I think that project is certainly doing much better. And if growth continues, then it's going to end up being successful. And to get some facts into part of this discussion, the Department of Commerce has worked with the Department of Revenue. We've looked at actual sales tax returns and sales tax data and compared that to the projections that these Star Bond projects had when the bonds were sold. And almost 80% of the projects are on pace to pay off early or to pay off on time. there's at least 5 that I can tell you right now have paid off early. That's Hutchinson, that's Village West. Derby had some star bonds that paid off early. We heard about the Manhattan Star Bond project, the Flint Hills Discovery Center. It paid off early, and Sporting Park paid off early. If you're talking about a project that didn't come online until 2018 or 2019 or 2022, it's patently unfair to look at that project in a snapshot and compare that project to what it's going to be like in 10 or 15 years. So we would encourage you to focus on actual numbers, actual sales tax numbers that are coming into these star bond districts and are being applied to the star bonds.
Vice Chair Tarwater.
Okay, thank you. So 80% of the star bonds are projected to pay off early, and the maximum amount of bonds that are available under the star bond bill are 20 years, right?
Correct.
Not 100.
Correct.
Okay.
The
All right.
the
Just wanted to say we have
Speedway is the exception to
Right.
that. It's got 30 years. And I guess one other point while I'm here is the Village West project. If you look at a map of Wyandotte County in 1997, there was nothing there, 0 revenue. Today, the state of Kansas receives almost $41 million a year that goes into the state general fund from that Village West project. By comparison, all the dollars the state invests in the other star bond projects is 48 million, maybe 50 million. So that one single project is going to provide the state $41 million for a long time.
Thank you for clearing all of that up. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Senator Reddy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. North, for being here this evening. I do appreciate the chart that staff has given us. So oftentimes we see star bonds that have been approved, and I know not all of them get approved. In Manhattan, for example, we tried to extend one of our star bond districts to closer to a Kansas State University for a different project, and that was denied. So I wanted to know, and you may not have the information, but how many do you typically get that request to star bonds, and how many get rejected? Because what we have in front of us are the ones that have been approved. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. I think by the time a star bond project gets to the point of a decision being made, we've got a good idea as to whether it's financially feasible, whether it's going to draw the visitation that we're looking for, whether it's going to provide the quality of life enhancements that we're looking for with star bonds. I would think in the last 4 or 5 years, we've probably had 8 to 10 projects that we had discussions with the city, we had discussions with a developer, but for those reasons, decided not to go forward with the project. So it's not uncommon.
Before we get to Representative Hoffman's question, I've just been informed that what I believed was written only testimony. I believe that Will Lawrence is here and does want to address the committee on behalf of the governor. I believe that's correct. So, Mr. Lawrence, if you do want to address the committee, my apologies. We will give you time to address the committee as a neutral conferee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hate to interrupt Bob North. I think a lot of you know him. He's extremely credible when it comes to this issue. I'll be very brief. My testimony is very brief. The governor is at this point neutral on the bill, and I'll explain why. We have, in fact, been involved in discussions about shaping the legislation and making sure that it made sense for the Star Bonds tool. That's been done through Department of Commerce, Bob North, and I've been involved in some of those discussions. So where the bill is today, maybe some things we could quibble over, a couple of things that we've said, well, I'd rather it be written this way or that way, that didn't get changed, but a lot of it did. And if this bill were to land on the governor's desk as it is, we don't have concerns over the bill. Nothing that would warrant a veto or for it to not be signed. Obviously, it's got to go through the legislative process. You all will have plenty of discussion, may amend it. We will be monitoring it and giving any feedback in real time. This is a very short session, so if anything major goes in the bill, it's a problem. We will try to make sure that that's known so that this bill can be successful if it passes. I think in terms of just, the overall opponent testimony, I'm not going to dive into all that. And I think, again, Bob North just did a great job of really explaining fact from the fiction and some of the theoretical stuff we're talking about. I mean, at the end of the day, this is a good opportunity. The bill needs to be crafted the right way. The deal needs to be crafted the right way for Kansans. This is the first step in that process. You got to go through a lot of things, a lot of studies, and lots of work to get to an end product that the legislature is going to have input in through leadership and the way this bill is structured. So overall, we're confident with the product as is, and we'll keep monitoring it. But overall, we think it's a good product. Happy to answer any questions at the right time.
Thank you, Ms. Lawrence. Again, my apologies. I believe I was informed you were written only, but glad you were able to get your comments in. We'll go ahead and take, if you don't mind, Representative Hoffman. Are there questions for Mr. Lawrence? Okay, seeing none, we will go to Representative Hoffman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Bob, and I know that what we're talking about is different than most of our other projects, but I was kind of wondering about the handout. Could you kind of tell us real quickly what does it mean by the status open closed, where it has like 15 open, 13 closed on this, and then also this is not a complete list. Is it those that are have been paid off in the past are not on this? Am I right?
So there may be an error with some of the pagination here, but I think this refers to when it's closed. That means the bonds have been paid off. So, for example, the Flint Hills Discovery Center project, that would be the second line down, and if that correlates to that far right-hand column, then that would reflect that those bonds have been paid off.
Okay, all right. Just trying to understand this a little better. Thank you.
Other questions? Seeing none.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Vice Chair Tarwater, committee members, conferees, and especially the staff for putting in the work to get this information available. Before I close, I see we have one additional question. That's okay, Representative Osmond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to find out if there was any additional neutral testimony. I saw somebody on the list, so just wasn't sure.
No, there is not. Okay, with that, thank you to everyone for all of your hard work, and we are adjourned.